At first glance, it did not look like a catastrophe. It looked like an interruption, as if 9 figures had stepped outside for a moment and would return before the wind covered their tracks. A tent stood half-collapsed on a wind-scoured slope in the northern Urals. Inside were boots, heavy coats, food, cameras, diaries, tools, everything a person would need to survive a winter in the northern Urals. Everything except those who had slept there. 3 long cuts opened the canvas from the inside. Below the camp, a line of footprints descended toward the distant tree line. Some had been made by feet wrapped only in socks. Others were nearly bare. But the tracks did not explode outward in chaos. They did not scatter across the slope. They moved in the same direction, close together, like a group walking, not running, into sub-zero darkness. 9 experienced hikers had abandoned their only refuge in the middle of the night, leaving behind the clothing that stood between them and death. Whatever was happening inside that tent must have seemed more dangerous than the mountain waiting outside. This is not a legend born beside a campfire. It happened to 9 real people, each with a name, a history, and a future that ended on the same winter night. Igor Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov. 9 names, 9 lives, and one winter night that would turn them into a mystery. History would call it the Dyatlov Pass incident. Yet even that name contains a quiet irony. Their final camp was not in the mountain saddle later named for Igor Dyatlov. It stood on the eastern slope of Kholat-Syakhl, a remote rise in the northern Ural Mountains where snow can smooth the landscape into a nearly featureless white expanse. January 1959. The Soviet Union celebrated endurance as a national virtue. Polar explorers, engineers, mountaineers, and test pilots were held up as proof that discipline, preparation, and collective strength could master whatever nature placed in their way. Igor Dyatlov belonged to that world completely. He was 23, a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, technically gifted, methodical, and already trusted to lead difficult journeys. He designed equipment, planned routes, and had crossed winter terrain that would have defeated less experienced teams. The others were not thrill-seekers wandering into danger. Most were students or graduates with substantial experience in cold-weather travel. The route they had chosen through the northern Urals was demanding enough to qualify for the highest category of touring certification recognized by the Soviet system at the time. That distinction matters, because nearly every version of this story begins with the same assumption. Trained people would never abandon a protected camp without a rational reason. And yet, at some point during that night, all 9 decided that leaving immediately was the rational choice. The expedition began on January 23, 1959, when the team left Sverdlovsk by train. Their diaries and photographs preserve a story that later retellings often erase. They were funny, energetic, occasionally irritated, entirely human. They sang, joked, repaired equipment, argued over who should carry what, and complained about the discomfort of a crowded railway carriage. Look at those photographs and there is no sense of 9 doomed figures walking toward a curse. There are young friends smiling at the beginning of an adventure, unaware that ordinary moments, a laugh beside the tracks, a meal shared in a wooden room, skis resting against a wall, would soon become the last clear images of their lives. And there is another detail the legend often hides. The party that left Sverdlovsk numbered 10, not 9. At an abandoned settlement known as Second Northern, Yuri Yudin became too ill to continue. On January 28th, he turned back alone. It was not a dramatic escape. It was a reluctant decision made by someone who expected to recover, return home, and see his friends again after the expedition. That decision saved his life. It also condemned him to spend the next 5 decades wondering what happened after he watched the others disappear into the snow. Johan would become the expedition's only survivor, not because he escaped the mountain, but because he never reached it. For the next several days, the remaining 9 pushed north through deep snow, hauling skis, food, a portable stove, cameras, notebooks, and a large tent stitched together from 2 smaller ones. It was heavy, awkward, and difficult to pitch, but it was their only real barrier against the cold. On February 1st, worsening weather drove them west of their planned route. They reached the exposed slope of Kolatsiakl. The forest lay below, offering protection from the wind, yet they stopped above it and began to make camp. For decades, that decision has been described as reckless, even inexplicable. It was not necessarily either. Descending into the trees would have meant surrendering hard-won altitude and repeating the climb the next morning. An exposed overnight camp may also have served the training goals of an expedition at this level. Their last photographs appear to show them cutting a flat platform into the snow before raising the tent. The canvas structure went up before darkness. According to the evidence recovered later, the stove was never installed that evening. Some food had been prepared. Clothing and footwear were arranged inside. The scene looked like a temporary home being settled for one difficult night. Then the written record stops. The shared diary ends without a warning. No sentence records fear. No photograph reveals an approaching threat. There is no final note saying the snow had begun to move, that something had been heard outside, or that the canvas was collapsing. Sometime during the night of February 1st, or in the early hours of February 2nd, all 9 left the tent. At least one of them cut through the canvas from inside. None returned. No telegram arrived. Dyatlov had expected to send word once the group reached civilization, probably around February 12th. But winter expeditions were often delayed, and at first, silence did not seem alarming. Concern gathered slowly, then suddenly. Relatives pressed for action. On February 20th, an organized search finally began. Students, instructors, local hunters, soldiers, aircraft crews, and officials moved into a landscape that nearly 3 weeks of wind and snowfall had already begun to rewrite. On February 26th, searchers found the tent. It was partly buried and damaged by weather, but much of the interior remained intact. Boots were still there. Heavy clothing was still there. Food, equipment, diaries, and cameras had not been taken. The group had not packed for a planned departure, and the entrance they had built was not the route everyone had used to escape. A forensic examination later identified 3 cuts made with a sharp blade from inside the canvas. Other damage was judged to be accidental tearing caused by weather, handling, or time. That distinction matters. The popular image of a tent violently slashed to pieces is exaggerated. The confirmed fact is quieter and more unsettling. Someone inside created openings through the wall that could be used as emergency exits. Nearly all the group's footwear remained behind. So did most of their heavy outer clothing. In darkness, in extreme cold, they had stepped onto an exposed mountainside with little between their bodies and the wind. Yet the footprints told a story more complicated than blind panic. 8 or 9 sets of tracks descended toward the tree line, nearly a mile below. They did not fan out across the slope. They did not show an obvious pursuit. Several searchers described them as walking prints. Whatever had forced the evacuation, it had not broken the group apart. Not yet. At the forest edge, beneath a tall cedar tree, searchers found the remains of a small fire. Nearby lay Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, the 2 members least protected against the cold. High above the ground, branches had been broken from the cedar. It is one of those details that can seem sinister when isolated from the rest of the scene. Some later theories imagine someone climbing to hide from an attacker, or to watch an unknown presence moving across the slope. But practical explanations fit the evidence more easily. A person may have climbed in search of dry branches. Someone may also have tried to look back toward the camp, waiting for the pale shape of the tent to appear whenever the blowing snow briefly opened. By the time the group reached the Cedar, their original emergency had changed. The mountain was no longer only something they were escaping. It had become something they needed to climb back into. 3 hikers were discovered at intervals between the Cedar and the tent: Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. Their positions are consistent with attempts to return uphill, although no one can establish exactly when they left the fire, whether they moved together, or how far each person believed the tent to be. They may have thought the danger above had passed. They may have understood that survival in the forest was impossible without boots, clothing, and equipment. None of them reached the camp. 4 members of the expedition were still missing. They remained hidden until early May, when the changing snowpack allowed searchers to locate an improvised platform of branches in a ravine near the Cedar. Beneath deep snow, in or near a stream channel, they found the final 4 hikers. Some had suffered severe internal injuries. With that discovery, the story changed again. What at first looked like a fatal evacuation now seemed to contain several different emergencies. Some members appeared to have died primarily from exposure. Others had trauma more commonly associated with powerful compression, a fall, or a heavy impact. How could the same night produce such different outcomes? The ravine itself offers one possible answer. Snow can conceal cavities above running water, steep drops, and uneven rock. In darkness, what appears to be a stable surface may be a roof over empty space. A fall or structural collapse into that hidden terrain, followed by the pressure of deep snow, could produce devastating injuries without requiring an explosion, a struggle, or an attacker. This remains a reconstruction, not a witnessed fact, but it is consistent with the landscape in which the final 4 were found. The soft tissue damage described in the autopsy records later became one of the most sensational parts of the case. In popular retellings, those injuries were treated as evidence of ritual violence or an unknown force. Yet prolonged exposure to water, natural decomposition, and animal activity provide conventional explanations. The findings were disturbing. They were not proof of murder, mutilation, or the supernatural. The original investigation searched for evidence that another group had entered the camp. No convincing trail was found. Valuables remained untouched. The identifiable trail that survived led away from the tent, while investigators found no convincing track of an unknown party approaching it. Investigators also questioned members of the indigenous Mansi community, many of whom knew the region and assisted with the search. They found nothing to support claims that the hikers had been attacked for trespassing on sacred territory. That theory endured anyway, not because the evidence pointed toward it, but because outsiders often find it easier to imagine a hostile local population than to accept how quickly a mountain can defeat even those who appear prepared. In May 1959, prosecutor Lev Ivanov closed the criminal case. He found no evidence of homicide and attributed the deaths to what the official conclusion described as an overwhelming natural force the hikers had been unable to overcome. It was a conclusion without a clear mechanism. No sequence was established. No specific natural event was named. The phrase offered no real mechanism, and because it resolved so little, it became one of the most enduring lines in the entire mystery. Then came the silence that only a closed society can produce. Records remained difficult to access. The region was restricted for a period. Families were left with the belief that they had never received a complete explanation. Every missing page, every vague official phrase, every unanswered question made secrecy itself feel like evidence. Decades later, Ivanov claimed that he had been pressured during the investigation and discussed reports of unexplained lights in the sky. Accounts of glowing objects elsewhere in the wider region were gradually folded into the Dyatlov legend. But no surviving evidence places such an object above the hikers' camp that night. No diary entry connects the expedition to an aerial phenomenon. No photograph reliably captures a mysterious light over the tent. The reports exist. The connection remains unproven. In a political system shaped by secrecy, an information vacuum rarely stays empty. Suspicion moves in first. The radiation findings had the same effect. Tests detected elevated contamination on parts of some clothing. Those readings were real. They were also limited, and they did not prove that anyone on Kholat Syakhl had been exposed to a weapon. At least one member of the expedition had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility after the major 1957 accident there. A contaminated workplace, earlier exposure, or previously worn clothing provides a more conventional explanation for the readings. That does not make the radiation irrelevant. It places it in context. The evidence is genuine. The leap from that evidence to a secret weapon is not. Military theories remain seductive because they appear to solve two mysteries at once. They offer a sudden reason for the evacuation and an explanation for the state's lack of transparency. Over the years, proposed causes have included rockets, parachute mines, classified weapons tests, and encounters with military personnel. Yet no verified record has surfaced of a weapon striking the camp. No blast crater was documented. No clear explosive pattern was recorded. The surviving tracks do not show a second party arriving, surrounding the tent, or directing the hikers downhill. A cover-up is possible in the abstract sense that almost any scenario can be imagined. Evidence for this specific cover-up has never reached the level of proof. Other natural explanations solve one part of the puzzle and fail at the next. Hurricane-force winds could make the exposed slope unbearable, but wind alone does not adequately explain the emergency cuts or the abandoned boots. Infrasound has been proposed as a trigger for panic, yet this remains speculative and would require all 9 experienced hikers to react in an extreme, highly coordinated way to an invisible stimulus. Carbon monoxide poisoning is unlikely because the stove was apparently not operating. A violent dispute within the group fits neither the organized dissent nor the lack of clear signs of a struggle inside the camp. That leaves the theory argued over longer than any other: snow itself. For decades, many investigators rejected an avalanche. The visible slope appeared too gentle. When searchers reached the camp 26 days later, they reported no obvious avalanche debris. A ski pole near the tent was still upright. Footprints remained visible below the site. And one objection seemed especially difficult. If the hikers weakened the slope by cutting a platform into it, why would the snow remain still through the evening, then move only hours later? In 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the case with a deliberately narrow focus on natural causes. In July 2020, they announced that an avalanche, poor visibility, and extreme weather best explained the tragedy. Their reconstruction proposed that a moving slab of snow forced the evacuation. Once the group reached the forest, deteriorating visibility prevented them from locating the tent again, leaving them to improvise protection below. It was an official conclusion, but it did not end the argument. Some relatives and independent researchers rejected parts of the reconstruction. The prosecutor's office did not publish a complete scientific analysis capable of answering every objection. The announcement supplied a broad sequence, but not the final proof many observers expected. The most important scientific development came from elsewhere. In 2021, researchers Johan Gaume and Alexander Puzrin published a peer-reviewed study examining whether a small, delayed slab avalanche was physically possible at the campsite. Their claim was carefully limited. They did not present a complete history of the night or claim to know precisely how each person died. Instead, they tested one central question. Could snow move in the right place with enough force after a delay of several hours? Their model looked beneath the smooth, visible surface of the slope to the terrain hidden below it. The ground was irregular, with steeper buried sections that would not necessarily be obvious to someone standing above the snow. A weak layer could follow that hidden shape even where the exposed surface appeared too shallow for danger. By cutting a level platform for the tent, the hikers may have removed support from the lower edge of a dense slab. Strong winds could then deposit additional snow above the camp, increasing the load hour after hour. Eventually, under the right conditions, the slab could cross a threshold. It would not have to resemble the roaring wall most of us imagine when we hear the word avalanche. A compact section of dense snow might shift only a short distance, enough to strike part of the tent, press occupants beneath the canvas, damage the shelter, block the usual exit, and make a larger release seem imminent. And crucially, it could happen after a delay. The hikers may have pitched the tent safely, eaten, organized their clothing, and settled for the night before the accumulating load finally destabilized the weak layer. A small slab would also leave less obvious evidence than a major avalanche. After 26 days of severe wind, drifting snow, and changing weather, much of its surface signature could disappear. Later field investigations documented that avalanches do occur in the area, and the terrain near the proposed camp location can be steeper than it appears from a distance. For the first time, a scientific model offered a plausible mechanism connecting the cut platform, the delayed emergency, the damaged tent, and the urgent departure. But physically possible is not historically proven. The model depends on values that can no longer be established with certainty. The camp's exact location, the buried shape of the ground, the internal structure of the snowpack, the wind loading, and the precise timing of the release. It can explain why a delayed slab might occur, but it cannot tell us who made the first cut, who may have been injured inside, what was said in the darkness, or what each person believed would happen next. There is also a competing account of the most severe injuries. The Snow-Slab model allows for serious but initially survivable trauma inside the tent. The prosecutor's official scenario placed the worst injuries later, during a fall or collapse into the ravine. Both mechanisms are physically possible, and the evidence that survived cannot choose cleanly between them. And yet, when the night is reconstructed as a sequence rather than a collection of strange details, the group's actions begin to look less like panic and more like procedure. Picture the first moment. A heavy section of snow strikes or presses against the tent. The canvas drops. The normal entrance is blocked, difficult to reach, or simply too slow. In the confined darkness, someone grabs a blade and cuts through the wall. Outside, wind tears across the slope. Snow cracks or shifts nearby. No one can know whether the movement has stopped or whether a larger release is coming. The group leaves immediately. They descend together toward ground that appears safer. Their decision may be temporary in their own minds. Reach the forest, wait, regroup, return when the slope stabilizes. The tent, they assume, will still be visible above them. Then the mountain erases it. Blowing snow covers their tracks. Darkness removes the horizon. The slope loses contrast until distance becomes impossible to judge. A pale tent that seemed easy to relocate disappears into a moving wall of white. The forest gives them wood for a fire and some protection from the wind, but not enough of either. The cold continues to drain strength, coordination, and time. Some clothing appears to have been redistributed as conditions deteriorated. Some begin the climb back toward the tent. Others move deeper toward the ravine, where snow and branches might provide better protection. One emergency divides into several smaller decisions. Each may be reasonable in isolation. Each becomes more dangerous as the night continues. This reconstruction does not require irrational panic in the dramatic sense of the word. It requires trained hikers making decisions with virtually no reliable information. The hikers may have followed the kind of procedure their experience suggested. Leave a suspected avalanche zone, remain together, reach cover, then return when conditions improve. The first decision may have been correct. The conditions that followed may have made it fatal. That possibility is more unsettling beyond any story about monsters or secret weapons, because it does not depend on the hikers behaving foolishly. It depends on the mountain changing faster than even an experienced team could adapt. And that is why the Dyatlov Pass story refuses to end. Not because every strange detail points toward a single hidden enemy, but because the evidence preserves only fragments of a much longer chain. Cuts through canvas, a line of footprints descending together, a fire beneath a cedar, 3 bodies found along the route back uphill, 4 more hidden beneath deep snow. Each fragment answers one question and opens another. The investigation began after weather had already transformed the slope. The only witnesses capable of explaining their choices were gone. The original inquiry was brief, opaque, and conducted within a system that often treated uncertainty as something to be closed, filed, and forgotten. Modern science can calculate mechanisms that investigators in 1959 could not model. It can reconstruct wind loading, snow pressure, buried terrain, and impact. What it cannot do is recover a vanished minute from a night with no survivors. Perhaps a small slab of snow set the sequence in motion. Perhaps the ravine caused the worst injuries. Perhaps poor visibility turned a temporary evacuation into a final separation from the equipment above. Together, those possibilities formed the most coherent natural explanation now available. More coherent than a monster, a secret unit, or a weapon for which no reliable evidence has surfaced. But one question remains outside every model. Inside that tent, in the moments before the first blade touched the canvas, what did 9 experienced, capable, clear-headed hikers hear? What did they feel? What did they see or believe was about to happen that made an open mountainside in the middle of a lethal winter night seem like the safer place to be? Snow may explain how the chain began. Cold may explain why they could not survive it. The silence still guards the moment they chose to leave.